History calls him the King of Kings, the man who lashed the sea itself. But history forgot to tell you about the women he buried alive, right inside his own bedroom. Tonight, do not seek tales of glorious conquests. Instead, listen to the cries of the little girls who never grew up, those forced to call their abuser father. This is not a story about a throne. This is a story of how one person found light at the bottom of a living hell. The sun was dying over the Zagros mountains, bleeding a bruised purple light across the stone terraces of Persepolis. Outside the high walls, the wind howled, kicking up dust storms that scoured the face of the earth. But here, inside the heart of the empire, the air was still. It was a stagnant, suffocating heat that clung to the skin like a wet shroud. The city itself, the jewel of Persia, held its breath, waiting for the night to fall. But for those trapped within the inner sanctum, nightfall brought no relief, only a deeper, more terrified silence. I sat in the corner of the preparation chamber, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as a shadow. My name is Roxana. I am 14 years old, with the dark, heavy eyes of the Achaemenid line and hands that have learned the art of invisibility. I am a daughter of the king, yet I possess no title, no land, and no future. I am merely a piece of the collection, waiting on a shelf until the owner decides to reach for me. Tonight, however, the hand of fate had not reached for me. It had reached for Elara. Elara stood in the center of the room, stark naked, shivering despite the oppressive warmth of the braziers. She was the same age as me, perhaps a month younger, with skin the color of pale almond and hair that usually cascaded like a river of ink. Now that hair was being pulled and pinned by the servants. Elara looked less like a human being and more like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together, fragile, vacant, and terrified. Two female servants hovered around her. They were older women, their faces etched with the deep lines of a lifetime spent in silent servitude. They did not speak. They did not look Elara in the eye. One of them dipped her hands into a bowl of warmed oil. The scent of myrrh and heavy rose hit me instantly. A cloying, sweet perfume used to mask the smell of unwashed bodies. Or in this place, the smell of cold, sour sweat. I watched the servants' hands. They were trembling. The oil glistened on Elara's shoulders, but she didn't flinch. She had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, her eyes fixed on a spot on the marble floor. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her to run, but there was nowhere to run. The heavy cedar doors were barred. "Chin up!" a voice rasped from the shadows near the entrance. It was Mithridates, a junior eunuch assigned to the harem's evening watch. He was a creature of soft flesh and hard eyes, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a cat. He wore the fine linens of the court, but his presence was cold, void of any warmth or pity. He tapped a long, thin cane against his palm. Elara lifted her chin. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean line through the oil on her cheek. The servant quickly wiped it away, her own fear palpable. To present a weeping gift to the king was to invite death. "She is ready," the servant whispered, her voice barely audible. Mithridates nodded. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply opened the door. The darkness of the corridor beyond seemed to swallow the light from the room. Elara stepped forward, her legs stiff, walking like a prisoner to the gallows. As the door clicked shut, the silence that rushed back into the room was heavy enough to crush bones. I couldn't breathe. The smell of the roses was making me gag. I needed air. I needed to be anywhere but here. I waited until the servants began cleaning the bowls, distracted by their own relief that their task was done. I slipped out through the servants' passage, moving on bare feet across the cold stone. I knew the layout of the harem better than the architects who built it. I knew the blind spots where the eunuch's eyes didn't reach. I found myself in the old bathhouse, a section of the palace that had fallen into disuse years ago when the new, grander baths were built for the wives. Here, the air was damp and smelled of mildew and ancient soap. The tiles were cracked, and the only light came from a high, narrow vent near the ceiling. I slid down against the wall, the rough stone biting into my back. Finally, the dam broke. I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle the sobs that racked my body. Crying was dangerous. Sound was dangerous. But the image of Ilara's dead eyes haunted me. My hand brushed against the wall as I wept, fingers scrabbling against the damp mortar. I felt something shift. A loose stone near the floor, right behind the water basin. It was a habit of mine. A nervous tick to pick at things. Loose threads, peeling paint, loose stones. I dug my fingernails in and pried the brick loose. I had intended only to find a hollow space to hide a small, polished stone I had found in the garden, a tiny piece of rebellion. But the space was not empty. My fingers brushed against something soft. Cloth. I pulled it out. It was a bundle of rough linen, stained brown and stiff with age. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a silver hairpin. I stopped breathing. The pin was shaped like a peacock, its tail feathers inlaid with tiny lapis lazuli stones. I knew this pin. I had brushed the hair it held 1,000 times. It belonged to Atossa, my older sister. Atossa, who had vanished a month ago. The eunuchs had told us she had been chosen for a high honor, married off in secret to a satrap in the northern provinces to secure a loyal alliance. They said she had left in the night, weeping with joy. I stared at the cloth in my hand. The brown stains were not mud. They were copper and iron. They were dried blood. The lie unraveled in my hands. There was no marriage. There was no journey to the north. Atossa had never left the palace. She had been taken to the king's chamber, just like Ilara, and she had displeased him. And then, she had been erased. I clutched the bloody pin to my chest, the cold silver biting into my skin. The tears stopped instantly, replaced by a chill that started in my marrow. The harem was not a home. It was a slaughterhouse wrapped in silk, and I was just another lamb waiting for the butcher's knife. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the hall of silence. It only brought the light necessary for the eunuchs to see our mistakes. We were kneeling on the limestone floor. There were 20 of us, a row of bowed heads and trembling spines. We had been here since the last changing of the guards, hours before dawn. My knees were no longer part of my body. They were screaming knots of fire and ice, grinding against the unforgiving stone. But I did not move. To move was to invite the cane. The air in the hall was cold, deliberately so. It kept us awake. It kept us sharp. Pacing before us was Aspamitres. He was the high eunuch, the keeper of the king's keys and the king's secrets. He was a tall man, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for his torso. His face was a hairless mask of powdered skin, smooth and unlined, making it impossible to guess his age. He wore saffron robes that rustled like dry leaves, the only sound in the vast, vaulted chamber. "You are breathing too loudly," Aspamitres whispered. His voice was soft, sibilant, like a snake sliding over sand. He stopped behind a girl 3 spots down from me. I heard the whistle of the cane before I heard the impact. Thwack! A sharp, stifled gasp followed, then immediate silence. The girl did not cry out. She knew better. "The King of Kings does not require your noise," Aspamitres lectured, resuming his pace. "He does not require your conversation. He does not require your tears. Tears are an insult. To weep in his presence is to suggest that the paradise he provides is insufficient. It is treason." I stared at the intricate patterns in the marble floor, forcing my mind to detach from the pain in my legs. I thought of the bloody hairpin hidden in the bathhouse wall. I thought of Atossa. Had she cried? Was that her crime? "You are not here to be wives," Aspamitres continued, his shadow falling over me. "You are not here to be mothers. You are vessels. You are art. When the king looks at you, he must see perfection. A statue does not complain. A statue does not flinch. A statue does not have needs. You must become living marble." This was the twisted truth of our existence. Xerxes, in his growing madness, had tired of human connection. Humans were messy. They had demands, families, and betrayal in their hearts. He wanted the beauty of a woman, but the obedience of an object. He wanted dolls. Beside me, I heard a soft, rhythmic wheezing. It was Shireen. She was the youngest among us, barely 12 years old, a wisp of a girl with eyes too big for her face and wrists that looked like they would snap under the weight of her gold bracelets. She had been brought to the harem only a week ago, torn from a minor noble family in the provinces. She hadn't learned the art of invisibility yet. I could see Shireen swaying out of the corner of my eye. Her skin was the color of ash. She was exhausted, her spirit breaking under the strain of the silence. "Steady," I breathed, the word forming on my lips without sound. "Don't fall. Please don't fall." Aspamitres turned at the far end of the line. He began walking back toward us. Shireen let out a small, pathetic whimper. It was involuntary, the sound of a puppy kicked in the dark. The saffron robe stopped moving. "Who?" Aspamitres asked. "Who dares to interrupt the perfection?" Shireen was trembling violently now. The terror was physically shaking her apart. She couldn't hold it anymore. Her body, starved of sleep and paralyzed by fear, simply gave up. She collapsed sideways. It wasn't a graceful faint. She hit the stone with a sickening thud, her small limbs tangled in her silk tunic. My body moved before my mind could stop it. It was an instinct born of the sisterhood we shared in this cage. I broke my posture. I reached out, grabbing Shireen's shoulder to pull her up, to steady her, to hide her weakness before the shadow reached us. "Get up!" I hissed. A boot slammed into my ribs. The air left my lungs in a rush of agony. I was knocked backward, sprawling onto the cold floor. Aspamitres stood over us. He didn't look angry. That would have been human. He looked bored. With a casual flick of his foot, he kicked Shireen away from me. She rolled across the stone like a discarded rag doll, too weak to even protect her face. "Compassion," Aspamitres said, looking down at me with eyes like black glass, "is a flaw. It suggests you believe this creature deserves something better than her fate. It suggests you question the order of things." He raised the cane. I flinched, expecting the blow, but he didn't strike me. He pointed the tip of the cane at Shireen, who was sobbing silently into the floor, her shoulders heaving. "Look at her," he commanded. "She is broken. The king has no use for broken things. And you, Roxana, you tried to fix her. You think you can save her?" He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could smell the peppermint on his breath, masking the rot of his teeth. "You cannot even save yourself. Return to your knees." I wanted to claw his eyes out. I wanted to scream that he was a monster, that we were flesh and blood, not stone. But the image of the bloody hairpin flashed in my mind. Rebellion was death. Survival was the only revenge. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself back up. My ribs throbbed with every heartbeat. I straightened my back. I fixed my eyes on the wall. I returned to the position of the statue. "Good," Aspamitres murmured, straightening up. "Perhaps there is hope for you yet." He signaled to two guards standing by the door. They marched over, grabbed Shireen by her arms, and dragged her out. Her feet trailed uselessly on the ground. She looked at me one last time, a look of pure, terrified pleading. I didn't look back. I didn't reach out. I stared straight ahead, my face a mask of stone. Inside, however, the fear was gone. It had burned away in the flash of pain from his boot. In its place, something cold and hard was settling in my chest. I would learn their lesson. I would become the statue they wanted. I would be silent. I would be perfect. And one day, when they least expected it, the statue would move. The silence we had been trained to perfect was shattered, not by a whisper, but by the thunder of iron. It began at the outer gates, a rhythmic, grinding roar that vibrated through the limestone floors of the harem. It was the sound of 10,000 immortals marching in defeat. The king had returned. He did not return with the spoils of Athens or the ashes of Sparta. He brought back only the dust of the road and a darkness that seemed to swallow the torches in the hallways. The harem, usually a place of languid, terrifying boredom, instantly transformed into a fortress under siege. The heavy cedar doors were barred from the outside. The eunuchs, usually so composed in their cruelty, moved with frantic, jerky motions, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored our own. "Head down, eyes down. Do not breathe unless commanded," Aspamitres hissed, his voice lacking its usual smooth arrogance. We were herded into the great hall of the harem, the same place where we had learned to be statues. But tonight we were not statues. We were the last remnants of a crumbling ego. The doors burst open. Xerxes entered. I had seen paintings of my father. In them, he was a giant, a golden deity sitting on a high throne while the world knelt. The man who stumbled into the room was not a god. He was a ruin. His beard, usually oiled and curled, was matted with grit. His tunic, dyed the purple of Tyrian snails, was stained with wine and sweat. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in my veins. They were red-rimmed, wild, and darting around the room as if he were surrounded by invisible assassins. He carried a heavy akinakis, a short Persian sword, dragged loosely in one hand, the metal tip scraping a jagged line across the polished floor. "They think they can laugh," Xerxes muttered, his voice a low growl that carried to the back of the room. He swung the sword suddenly, smashing a porcelain vase filled with lilies. The crash was deafening. Water and flowers spilled like blood across the marble. The sea laughed. The Greeks laughed. "Do you laugh?" He spun around, facing the line of us. His daughters, his possessions. "No, great king," the eunuchs chorused, dropping to their bellies. Xerxes ignored them. He wanted us. He stalked toward the line, bringing with him the smell of sour wine and stale fear. He was looking for something to break, something that would not fight back, to prove that he was still the master of the world. "The world outside is chaos," he announced, stepping close to a girl named Pari, who stood 5 places down from me. Pari was trembling. Xerxes leaned in, inhaling the scent of her fear. "But here, I am the sun. I am the order." He moved down the line. He didn't look at faces, he looked at property. He grabbed one girl by the hair, tilting her head back to inspect her teeth like a horse trader, then shoved her away with a grunt of disgust. "Too weak," he spat. "Persia is weak because its blood is thin." My heart hammered against my ribs, a traitorous drum in the silence. "Be stone," I told myself. "Be the marble." I fixed my gaze on the gold embroidery of his tunic, refusing to meet his eyes. I locked my knees. I stopped my breath. He stopped in front of me. The air around him was hot, radiating the fever of a man consumed by his own failure. I saw his boots, caked in the mud of a long retreat. I saw the tremor in the hand that held the sword. "Look at me," he commanded. It was not a shout. It was a whisper, dangerous and intimate. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I raised my eyes. For a moment, the madness in his face faltered. He stared at me, and I saw a flicker of recognition, not of a father recognizing a child, but of a man recognizing a mirror. "You," he breathed. The sword came up. The cold steel pressed against the soft skin under my chin. It was sharp, terrifyingly sharp. I felt the bite of the metal, a stinging line of heat as a single drop of blood welled up and trickled down my neck. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I held his gaze with the dead, hollow stare I had perfected on the kneeling floor. Xerxes leaned closer, his pupils dilated. He wasn't seeing Roxana. He was seeing himself, the arrogance, the defiance, the darkness that he had passed down through his blood. He saw the very thing he hated most, his own reflection staring back at him, judging him. "This one," he whispered, a twisted smile curling his lips. "These eyes, they are too much like mine." He pressed the blade harder, just enough to let the fear taste the blood, but not enough to kill. "Not yet." "I see the fire in there," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of loathing and fascination. "And fire must be controlled, or it must be extinguished." He withdrew the sword abruptly, wiping my blood onto his sleeve. He turned to Aspamytris, who was still prostrate on the floor. "Keep this one," Xerxes barked, pointing the bloody blade at me. "She thinks she is iron. We will see if she melts." He turned and stormed out of the hall, leaving the shattered vase and the smell of terror in his wake. As the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us back into the darkness, I raised a hand to my throat. My fingers came away red. I was no longer just a ghost in the harem. I had been seen, and to be seen by the monster was the most dangerous thing of all. The summons did not come at dawn, when hope is fragile, nor at noon, when the sun is honest. It came at the hour of the wolf, that bleeding edge of twilight when the day has died, but the night has not yet fully taken its throne. 3 days had passed since the king had marked me with his sword. 3 days of waiting in a silence so thick it felt like drowning. When the heavy cedar door to our quarters finally groaned open, I did not need to look up to know who stood there. It was not Mithridates. It was a pair of mute guards, their faces covered by black veils, flanked by Cassandane, my mother. Cassandane was a woman whose beauty had been eroded by 14 years of fear, like a cliff face battered by the sea. Her hair, once the color of ravens, was streaked with prematurely gray strands. She stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and wet. She wasn't looking at the guards. She was looking at me. "No," she whispered. It was a word she had lost the right to speak years ago. "She is not ready. She is a child." One of the guards stepped forward, shoving Cassandane aside with the callous indifference one might show a stray dog. She stumbled, hitting her shoulder against the doorframe, but she didn't fall. She lunged for me, her fingers gripping my arm with a strength born of pure desperation. "Run, Roxana," she hissed, though there was nowhere to run. "Don't let them take you." The guards didn't speak. They simply pulled us apart. It wasn't a struggle. It was a tearing. I was dragged into the corridor, and my mother was thrown back into the darkness of our room. The last thing I heard was the sound of the bolts sliding home, locking her in. Then came the pounding, fist against wood. A rhythmic, dull thudding accompanied by a wail that rose and fell, tearing through the polite silence of the harem. Thud, thud, thud. As I was marched down the hallway toward the preparation chambers, the pounding grew fainter. It didn't stop because she gave up. It stopped because the stone walls of the palace swallowed her grief. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. It was the silence of a grave. I was brought to the bathing chamber, but this was not the gentle, scented ritual I had watched Ilara endure. This was an erasure. The servants were different this time. Rougher, efficient, cold. They stripped the tunic from my body and pushed me into a basin of water that was scalding hot. I gasped, the heat biting into my skin, but hands held me down. They scrubbed me. They used sponges that felt like sandpaper, scouring my skin until it burned raw and red. They weren't cleaning me. They were trying to scrub away the dirt of my humanity. They wanted to wash away Roxana, the girl who hid in bathhouses and collected broken things and leave behind only a vessel worthy of a god. They oiled me, not with the sweet rose scent of the others, but with something muskier, heavier, amber and civet. It was a scent that clung to the back of the throat, animalistic and cloying. Then came the chains. They did not dress me in the flowing silks of a princess. Instead, they brought out a tray of gold. It was a lattice of fine golden chains, linked together with tiny rubies that looked like drops of fresh blood. "Stand still," a servant commanded. They draped the gold over my nakedness. The metal was cold against my fever-hot skin. It wound around my neck, crossed over my breasts, and circled my waist. It was beautiful, undeniably so. But as they clasped the locks, I felt the weight of it. These were not ornaments. They were shackles forged by master jewelers. I was being bound in gold, a sacrifice wrapped in the wealth of the empire I would never inherit. When I moved, the chains chimed softly, a delicate musical sound that announced my captivity with every step. The walk to the king's chamber was a journey through a nightmare. The corridors were empty, yet I felt 100 eyes on me. Behind the lattice work of every door I passed, I knew the other women were listening. They heard the chime of my golden chains, and they held their breath. There was no solidarity in the harem, only relief. Better her than me. The thought hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Their silence was complicit. It was the sound of survival. We reached the great double doors of the royal chamber. 2 immortals stood guard, their spears crossed. They uncrossed them at my approach, not out of respect, but out of protocol. Aspamitres was there, waiting in the shadows. He looked me up and down, his black eyes devoid of anything resembling a soul. "Remember," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "You are marble. If you break, you die." The doors were pushed open. I stepped across the threshold. The doors slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. I was alone. The room was vast, a cavern of shadows and silk. The air was thick with the smell of beeswax and stale wine. There were no windows, only high vents that let in no light. The only illumination came from a cluster of thick candles burning on a low table near the bed. The flames flickered in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows against the far wall. And there, projected onto the stone by the candlelight, was a shadow that stretched up to the ceiling. It was vast, distorted, monstrous. It was the silhouette of a man sitting on the edge of the bed, his head bowed, his shoulders hunched under the weight of an invisible sky. The shadow moved. The man stood up. Xerxes turned to face me. He was not wearing his crown. He was stripped to his waist, his chest scarred from old battles, his eyes dark pits in the gloom. He looked smaller than his shadow, yet infinitely more terrifying. "The girl with the fire," he murmured. The golden chains around my waist chimed as I trembled. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing my body to freeze. I was not Roxana. I was stone. I was gold. I was nothing. But as he took a step toward me, the candlelight caught the glint of the knife on the table behind him. The same knife he had used to peel fruit, or perhaps to test the purity of his bloodline. The monster on the wall seemed to reach out, its shadow hand extending to snuff out the only light in the room. The air in the room was not empty. It was solid. built from layers of silence and the heavy, cloying scent of frankincense burning in a golden brazier. Xerxes stood before me, the candlelight catching the sweat on his chest, turning the scars of old wars into glistening ridges of silver. He did not look at me with lust. That would have been a human emotion, a simple hunger of the flesh. No, he looked at me with the cold, clinical fascination of an architect examining a structure he intended to demolish. He reached out, his fingers rough and calloused, and traced the line of the gold chains crossing my collarbone. "Blood of my blood," he whispered, the words slurring slightly from the wine. "The Greeks say the gods do not bleed. They say the gods do not sin." He pulled on the chain, a sharp jerking motion that forced me to step closer. The rubies dug into my skin. "But if I am the king of kings," he hissed, leaning down until his breath, sour with grapes and rot, washed over my face, "then there is no sin. There is only my will. To break the law is to prove I am above it." He didn't want pleasure. He wanted transgression. He wanted to take the one thing that the laws of men and nature forbade him to touch, simply to prove that the lightning of Ahura Mazda would not strike him down. He was using me to wage a war against heaven. When his hands moved from the chains to my skin, I left. I did not run. There was nowhere to run. The heavy doors were barred, and the immortals stood guard outside. Instead, I ran inward. I remembered the lessons of the bathhouse. I remembered the cracks in the ceiling. 1. I took a breath. 2. I closed my eyes, but not to sleep. In the dark behind my eyelids, I visualized the heavy stone ceiling above us. I imagined myself becoming light, lighter than air, lighter than the shame that tried to anchor me to the floor. I floated up. I left the girl with the trembling hands and the golden shackles down below. From the ceiling, I looked down. I saw a small, fragile creature wrapped in metal. I saw a large, broken man consuming his own creation. I watched the scene as if it were a play performed by strangers in a language I did not speak. The girl down there was in pain, yes. I could see her body tense. I could see the silent scream trapped in her throat. But I was not her. I was the smoke from the brazier. I was the dust mote dancing in the candlelight. 3. Breathe in. 4. Breathe out. I counted the rhythms of existence to keep the madness at bay. The pain was distant, a dull throbbing that belonged to someone else. Xerxes murmured things into the ear of the girl below. Blasphemies, boasts, incoherent rants about the sea and the fire. But the words dissolved before they reached the ceiling. Time lost its shape. It might have been minutes. It might have been an eternity. Then there was a pause. The man pulled away, collapsing back onto the edge of the bed, panting heavily. The act of violation had exhausted him, not physically, but spiritually. He looked diminished, a god who had eaten the forbidden fruit and found it tasted only of ash. I drifted back down. Gravity took hold of me again. The pain rushed back, sharp and humiliating, reattaching itself to my nerves. I opened my eyes. I was standing near the low table where the wine jug sat. My hand, shaking uncontrollably, rested on the cool wood. And there it was, a knife. It was a small thing, used for peeling pomegranates. The handle was ivory, the blade curved and wicked, stained with the sticky drying juice of the fruit. It lay there, forgotten in the clutter of his indulgence. Xerxes had his back to me. His head was in his hands. He was muttering to himself, lost in the labyrinth of his own paranoia. My fingers curled around the ivory handle. The metal was cool against my sweating palm. It would be so easy. One step, one thrust into the space between his neck and shoulder. I knew where the artery was. The eunuchs had taught us anatomy, though for different reasons. I could end the monster. I could end the war against heaven, or I could turn the blade inward. One quick slash across my own wrist, and the shame would drain away onto the Persian carpets. I would be free. I would be with Atossa. I gripped the knife until my knuckles turned white. The rage rose in me like bile, hot and acidic. I wanted to see him bleed. I wanted to see the look in his eyes when the statue finally moved. I took a step forward. The gold chains chimed. Xerxes didn't hear it. He was too far gone. But in that silence, another sound echoed in my memory. Thud. 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 The sound of my mother pounding on the door. If I killed him, the immortals would rush in. They would not just kill me. They would tear the harem apart. They would drag Cassandain from her room and flay her alive for raising a traitor. If I killed myself, I left her alone in this hell. I left her to wonder, for the rest of her miserable life, what had happened behind these doors. The image of my mother's gray-streaked hair and her terrified eyes paralyzed me. My death would be my escape, but it would be her sentence. My hand trembled. The blade hovered inches from the possibility of freedom. I looked at the man who called himself a god. He was pathetic. He was hollow. Killing him would grant him a death he didn't deserve, a death of tragedy. And killing myself would give him exactly what he wanted, another broken thing to discard. Slowly, agonizingly, I unclenched my fingers. The knife clattered onto the table. The sound was sharp like a glass breaking. Xerxes lifted his head, turning slowly to look at me. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. He didn't realize how close death had just brushed against his neck. I stood there, the chains heavy on my skin, the shame burning in my blood. But I was breathing. 5. I chose to live. Not because life was sweet, but because survival was the only weapon I had left. The guards did not escort me back. They discarded me. The heavy cedar door of the confinement chamber was unbolted, and I was shoved inside with the careless force one uses for a sack of spoiled grain. I stumbled, the heavy gold chains around my waist bruising my hips as I hit the floor. The door slammed shut, the bolt sliding home with a sound that was final and absolute. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight bleeding through the high, barred window. In the corner, a mound of blankets stirred. It was my mother, Cassandain. She did not wake. She had cried herself into a stupor, her breathing ragged and heavy, the sleep of the emotionally drowned. I did not go to her. I could not let her touch me. I felt coated in a layer of invisible slime, a contamination that no water could wash away. The musk oil the servants had rubbed into my skin now smelled like rotting flowers. I was toxic. I crawled to the opposite corner of the room, near the wash basin. The stone pitcher that usually held water had been knocked over in the earlier struggle, its belly shattered against the wall. I picked up a shard of pottery. It was curved, jagged, and sharp enough to slice through the deception of living. I sat with my back against the cold stone wall, the shard pressing into the soft skin of my wrist. In the king's chamber, I had dropped the knife because I feared for my mother's life. But here, in the dark, the logic twisted. If I bled out quietly, if I simply went to sleep and never woke up, perhaps they would think it was a sickness. Perhaps they would spare her. I pressed the clay edge down. A bead of blood, dark as wine, welled up. It was the only thing about me that felt clean. Just a little deeper, the darkness whispered. Just a little deeper, and the chains fall off. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, waiting for the courage to make the final tear. My ear pressed against the limestone floor, and then the floor spoke. It began as a murmur, a vibration traveling through the bones of the palace. Persepolis was a marvel of engineering, a city built on secrets. Beneath the polished floors lay a labyrinth of clay pipes and stone channels, designed to carry water and steam, heating the royal baths and cooling the cellars. These hollow veins turned the palace into a giant whispering ear. I was sitting directly over one of the ventilation shafts connected to the royal bathhouse, the private sanctuary located just beneath the harem's eastern wing. Madness, a voice echoed through the stone. It was hollow, metallic, distorted by the pipes, but distinct. "It is not madness, it is divinity," a second voice replied, smooth and terrified. I knew that voice. It was Aspamitres, the high eunuch. He believes he is becoming Ahura Mazda himself. "He is becoming a liability," the first voice cut in, sharp and brutal. I froze. The shard in my hand hovered over my wrist. I pressed my ear harder against the cold stone, holding my breath. "The army is restless, Aspamitres. They have not been paid in 3 moons. The grain stores in Babylon are empty. And he spends the treasury building a gate to nowhere and defiling his own blood." I recognized the second speaker now. It was Artabanus. I had seen him only from a distance during the grand parades. He was the captain of the royal guard, the Hazarapatish. He was a man carved from oak and old leather, with broad shoulders that carried the weight of the army, and a face scarred by Greek spears. He was the king's shadow, his protector, the only man allowed to carry a weapon in the presence of Xerxes. "He threatened to execute the satraps of the East today," Artabanus continued, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. "He says they are plotting against him. Tomorrow, he might say it is me, or you." "We cannot touch him," Aspamitres whimpered. "The immortals." "The immortals answer to me," Artabanus growled. "The king is a man, men bleed, men die, and when a dog goes rabid, you do not try to reason with it. You put it down." The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls. "When?" Aspamitres asked, his voice barely a breath. "Tonight," Artabanus said. "When the moon hits the zenith, he will be tired. He will be alone. You have the key to the inner chamber." "I do." "Then use it. Leave the door unbarred. I will handle the rest." The voices faded as footsteps echoed away, presumably leaving the bathhouse. I sat there, paralyzed. The shard of pottery slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the floor. The drop of blood on my wrist had begun to dry, a small, dark crust. I looked at it. They were going to kill him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The monster was not a god. He was not a force of nature. He was just a man so broken and terrifying that even his own dogs were preparing to tear his throat out. Tonight, I looked at the jagged wound on my wrist. It was shallow, a scratch. If I died now, I died a slave. I died a victim of a man who would be a corpse before the sun rose. "No," I whispered. The word felt strange in my mouth. It was not a plea, it was a command. I tore a strip of fabric from the hem of my ruined tunic. My hands, which had been trembling with the desire for death moments ago, were now steady with a new, ferocious purpose. I wrapped the cloth around my wrist, pulling it tight, stemming the flow of blood. The hatred that had been a cold, heavy stone in my stomach suddenly ignited. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of a child anymore. It was cold. It was calculating. Xerxes was going to die. But if Artabanus and Aspamitres succeeded, the palace would turn into a slaughterhouse. They would purge the harem to remove any witnesses, any heirs, any loose ends. My mother and I were loose ends. I crawled back to the corner where Cassandane slept. I touched her shoulder, gently this time. "Wake up," I whispered into the dark. I was no longer the girl who wanted to leave her body. I was Roxana. I knew the secrets in the walls. I knew the layout of the pipes. And for the first time in my life, I knew something the powerful men outside did not. I knew their time was running out too. The silence of Persepolis did not break. It shattered. It happened exactly as the voices in the floor had promised, at the hour when the moon hung like a scythe over the Zagros mountains. I was awake, my back pressed against the cold stone of the cell, counting the heartbeats of the night. Beside me, my mother, Cassandane, slept the fitful sleep of the doomed. Then the scream came. It was not a woman's scream. It was a man's guttural wet sound that choked off into a gurgle. It was followed by the unmistakable clash of bronze against bronze, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, and the roar of many voices raised in anger. The coup had begun. "Roxana?" My mother bolted upright, her eyes wide and blind in the darkness. "What is that? Is it the king?" "The king is finished," I said, my voice steady. I felt a strange calm settle over me, cold and hard like the pottery shard I had held earlier. "Get up, Mother. We are leaving." I didn't wait for her to argue. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. She was light, too light, worn down by years of terror. I kicked the door. It was unlocked, just as Artabanus had commanded. The guard who was supposed to be watching us was gone, likely drawn into the slaughter, or already a part of it. We stepped into the corridor, and the world had turned upside down. The harem, usually a place of suffocating order, was a chaotic abattoir. Eunuchs, those untouchable wardens in their saffron robes, were running in panic. Some lay still on the polished marble, their silk stained dark with blood. The immortals, the elite guard, were fighting each other. Artabanus's men wore red bands on their arms, cutting down anyone who did not bear the mark. I kept my mother close to the wall, moving in the shadows. We had to reach the bathhouse, but I couldn't leave everyone. We passed the dormitory of the younger girls. I pushed the door open. Inside, they were huddled together like frightened sheep. "Pari!" I hissed. Pari, the girl Xerxes had terrorized in the Great Hall, looked up. Her face was pale, streaked with tears. Beside her was Tia, a mute servant girl who had often slipped me extra bread. Tia was small, quick, and invisible to the highborn, a perfect survivor. "Come," I commanded. "If you stay here, the new king will purge the house. Move." Pari hesitated, but Tia grabbed her hand, nodding at me with fierce determination. We were four now, a small army of ghosts moving through the wreck of the empire. We navigated the carnage. The air smelled of copper and bowels. We saw Aspamitres, the high eunuch who had kicked Shireen, backed into a corner by 3 soldiers. He was pleading, offering gold, offering secrets. The soldier in the front didn't listen. He drove a spear through the eunuch's chest. I didn't look away. I didn't feel pity. The statue had no tears for the sculptor. We reached the intersection leading to the royal chambers. The fighting here had been brutal, but it was over. Bodies of loyalist guards were piled like firewood. The great double doors to the king's bedroom, the room where I had almost lost my soul, stood wide open. I stopped. "Roxana, no," my mother whispered, pulling at my hand. "Don't look." But I had to look. I stepped into the doorway. The candles were still burning, casting their indifferent light on the scene. Xerxes lay on the floor, half tangled in the bedsheets. He did not look like a god. He did not look like the king of kings. He looked like a slaughtered ox. His chest was a ruin of stab wounds. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes staring up at the ceiling he had claimed to own. The golden Akinakis, his sword, lay uselessly just out of his reach. The blood was pooling around him, soaking into the priceless carpets, turning the intricate patterns into a singular, dark stain. I stood over him. The man who had terrorized the world, who had whipped the sea, who had broken his own daughters, was just meat. I felt the phantom weight of the golden chains he had forced me to wear. I felt the phantom blade at my throat. I gathered the saliva in my mouth. It was a crude act, a vulgar act, something a street urchin would do, not a princess of the Achaemenid line. But I was not a princess anymore. I was a survivor. I spit. The glob of spittle landed on the marble floor, right next to his cooling hand. It was my goodbye. It was my judgment. You were just a man, I whispered, and you died like a dog. Roxana! Tia signaled frantically from the hallway. Footsteps were approaching, heavy, armored boots. The second wave of the purge was coming. I turned my back on my father, on the king, on the corpse. To the bathhouse, I said, my voice cutting through the panic of my companions. To the vents. We are going down. We ran. We didn't look back at the gold, or the silk, or the dead. We ran toward the damp, dark promise of the sewers, leaving the palace of light to burn in its own sins. The throat of the palace swallowed us whole. We descended into the bowels of Persepolis, through a maintenance grate hidden behind the bathhouse boilers. The air here did not smell of rose water or fear. It smelled of ancient rot, damp earth, and the waste of 1,000 kings. It was the smell of truth. Careful, I whispered, gripping my mother's hand. Cassandane was shivering, her fine silk slippers sliding uselessly on the slick, moss-covered stones. Do not let go. We were crawling through the drainage system, the hidden veins of the empire designed to carry away the filth so the beautiful people above could pretend it didn't exist. Now, we were the filth. The tunnel was narrow, a suffocating tube of darkness that seemed to press against my chest. Tia, the mute servant girl, took the lead. She moved with the agility of a rat, her small hands feeling the walls for guidance. Pari followed, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. My dress, Pari whimpered, the expensive fabric snagging on a jagged root protruding from the ceiling. It is ruined. Good, I hissed back. Let it rot. We are not wearing it where we are going. We trudged through sludge that reached our knees. It was thick and cold, a vile mixture of mud and refuse. As we moved, the muck splashed onto us, coating our skin, our hair, and the hated jewelry I still wore. I looked down at the golden chains crossing my chest, the ones Xerxes had used to leash me. They were caked in brown slime. The rubies were dull, indistinguishable from pebbles. The gold no longer glittered. In the darkness of the sewer, the king's wealth was worthless. The mud was the great equalizer. It erased the oil of the harem. It erased the scent of the monster. I can't, my mother gasped, stumbling. She fell to her knees in the water, sobbing. Roxana, I can't breathe. It's too dark. I stopped. I pulled her up, my hands gripping her shoulders. My fingers left streaks of mud on her face, war paint for a battle she hadn't chosen. You lived through 14 years of his silence, I told her, my voice fierce and low. You will not die in his sewer. We are walking out of his grave, mother, step by step. She looked at me. In the gloom, she didn't see a child anymore. She saw the iron that had been forged in the fire of the king's madness. She nodded, wiping her face with a muddy hand, and stood up. We moved on. Time dissolved. There was only the sound of splashing water and the distant chittering of rats. Then Tia stopped. She tapped the stone wall 3 times. Ahead, a gray light filtered through a curtain of hanging vines. A draft of air hit my face. Not the stagnant air of the tunnels, but something sharp, cold, and achingly fresh. The exit. It was a storm drain that emptied into a dry riverbed outside the western walls, far from the main gates where the slaughter was taking place. The iron grate covering it was rusted, eaten away by years of neglect. Push, I commanded. Together, we threw our weight against the iron. It groaned, protesting the disturbance, flakes of rust raining down on us. With a final agonizing screech of metal, it gave way, swinging outward. We tumbled out onto the rocky ground, coughing and gasping. I rolled onto my back, my chest heaving. Above me, the sky was no longer black. It was a bruised purple, bleeding into a soft pale gold at the horizon. The Zagros Mountains stood silent watch as the sun began to crown their peaks. The wind bit at my wet skin, but it felt like a caress. It was the first breath of air I had taken in my life that didn't belong to Xerxes. I sat up. I looked at the others. We were unrecognizable. We were monsters of mud and slime, stripped of beauty, stripped of dignity. But we were alive. I reached for the clasp of the golden chains at my neck. My fingers, slippery with mud, fumbled with the lock. Finally, it clicked. I pulled the heavy lattice of gold and rubies from my body. It made a wet, heavy sound as I threw it onto the rocks. "Leave it," I said to Pari, who was staring at the jewels. "That is the price of admission to hell. We are not going back." We stood up, 4 women made of earth, and walked toward the rising sun. Behind us, the smoke from the burning palace began to rise, a black pillar mourning a dead god. 10 years later, the Aegean Sea was a sheet of hammered turquoise, stretching out to touch the sky. The air here, on the island of Naxos, smelled of salt and wild thyme. It was a clean smell. I sat on a wooden bench beneath the shade of an olive tree. A papyrus scroll spread across my lap. My hands were stained with ink, not mud. "Like this, Mama?" A little girl, no older than 10, looked up at me. She had wild, curly hair and eyes that held the spark of the ocean. "Almost, Ilara," I said softly, guiding her hand. "The letter Alpha must stand tall. It is the beginning." I named her after the friend I couldn't save. I named her so that the girl who died in the harem would live on in the sunlight. Ilara went back to her writing, her tongue poking out in concentration. I watched her, a fierce surge of love tightening my chest. She knew nothing of golden chains. She knew nothing of the silence. She knew only the sound of the waves and the voice of her mother reading stories of heroes who fought monsters. I looked down at my left wrist. The scar was still there, a thin white line where I had almost ended it all in the dark. But the sun had tanned my skin, and the line had faded, blending into the story of my body. It was no longer a wound. It was a map. It showed where I had been, and it proved that I had left. "Mama?" Ilara asked, pausing. "Who is the king in the story?" I smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached my eyes. "The king is just a shadow, little one," I told her, dipping my quill into the ink. "And shadows disappear when you turn on the light." I looked out at the sea, the vast open water that separated me from the ashes of Persepolis. I was not a princess. I was not a victim. I was the author of my own life. And the page was finally mine to write. History often remembers the kings who built the walls, but it forgets the survivors who climbed over them. Roxana's journey teaches us a powerful truth about our own daily lives. We may not live in a palace of gold or face a tyrant with a sword, but we all carry chains. These chains can be the trauma of our past, the fear of the future, or the silence we keep to survive difficult relationships or toxic environments. Xerxes had absolute power, yet he died a prisoner of his own madness. Roxana had nothing, yet she found freedom in the mud of a sewer. This reminds us that true power does not come from controlling others. It comes from mastering yourself. No matter how dark your situation feels, no matter how heavy your chains are, you possess the strength to break them. You are not defined by what has happened to you. You are defined by how you choose to rewrite your ending. If Roxana's courage touched your heart today, please press the like button to honor her memory. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength, so that the stories of the forgotten are never silenced again. And if you want to join us in uncovering the dark truths that history tries to hide, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. I pray that wherever you are right now, you are granted the courage to walk away from the things that hurt you. May God bless you with the strength to break every chain that holds you back. And may He guide you out of the darkness and into your own beautiful sunrise. If you believe that light will always conquer darkness, write Amen in the comments below.